You didn't become someone new. That's the misunderstanding everyone clings to when they finally realize they were wrong about you. They say you changed because it protects their ego. It allows them to believe time did the work, instead of admitting they failed to see what was standing in front of them the entire time. But the truth is quieter and far more uncomfortable. You were consistent. You were stable. You were already operating from the same internal center long before recognition arrived. What changed wasn't you. What changed was their capacity to perceive you accurately. Most people don't actually observe others. They filter. They project. They compress everything they see into categories that make their world predictable. Early on, you didn't fit cleanly into those categories. You weren't loud enough to be labeled dominant. You weren't reactive enough to be labeled weak. You didn't perform your value. You didn't advertise intent. So they misfiled you. Not out of malice, out of limitation. Human perception depends on contrast. People understand others by comparing behavior to expectation. You refused to supply predictable contrast. Your responses were measured. Your presence was steady. Your silence carried weight without demanding attention. That confuses systems built on signal spikes. In those systems, value is detected through urgency. Importance announces itself. Authority escalates. You did none of that. So they assumed absence where there was containment. They assumed neutrality where there was control. They assumed potential where there was already completion. Over time, pressure accumulated around you. Situations measured themselves around you. People tried different angles without realizing they were doing it. Humor, authority, dismissal, familiarity. Each attempt returned the same result. No shift, no collapse. No emotional yield. And slowly, without announcement, their internal models began to fail. They noticed that outcomes stabilized when you were involved, that conversations simplified, that conflict lost momentum in your presence. Not because you mediated, because nothing fed the escalation. You didn't absorb tension. You didn't mirror insecurity. You didn't amplify urgency. You remained internally timed. That's the part most never recognize until it's too late. Internal timing collapses external leverage. People who live on external cues can't move someone who doesn't respond to them. At first, they called it growth, then maturity, then confidence. They needed language to explain why their behavior around you was changing, but none of those words were accurate. Growth implies movement. Maturity implies development. Confidence implies compensation. You weren't compensating. You weren't developing. You weren't becoming. You were already there. And as their perceptions slowly adjusted, something else happened that they couldn't articulate. They stopped trying to define you. They stopped assuming access. They stopped expecting reaction. When expectation disappears, behavior reorganizes. People speak differently around fixed points. They don't test boundaries that don't announce themselves. They don't push what doesn't respond to urgency. They don't perform for someone who doesn't reward performance. This is when the phrase started circulating quietly. You've changed. Not because it was true, because it was easier than admitting they misread you from the start. The truth would require them to confront how often they mistake volume for value and movement for meaning. You exposed that without saying a word. by remaining unchanged while everything around you adjusted. You led a delayed recognition. They finally noticed who you were, because the environment no longer supported the impressions they projected onto you. Reality caught up. And when reality catches up, there's no apology, only revision. Once that revision began, it didn't stop. Because perception doesn't adjust all at once. It settles in layers. People start replaying interactions they dismissed before, conversations they rushed through, moments they misinterpreted because they were too busy managing their own position to actually see you. What they notice now is uncomfortable. You were never seeking advantage. You weren't positioning yourself for later recognition. You weren't planting seeds for future influence. You were already operating from completion while they were still negotiating identity. That's why their attention didn't land on you immediately. Attention is drawn to friction. You had none. You weren't climbing. You weren't competing. You weren't broadcasting struggle or ambition. In a world that mistakes motion for progress, stillness reads as absence until it doesn't. The shift happens when people realize that the outcomes they respect most weren't driven by pressure or persuasion, but by clarity. Your clarity didn't arrive suddenly. It was always present. What arrived was their ability to detect it. And detection only happens when noise exhausts itself. Over time, patterns emerged. They couldn't ignore. You weren't the loudest voice, but decisions seemed to align with your presence. You weren't the most visible person, but alignment happened faster when you were involved. You weren't asserting influence, yet influence appeared. That contradiction forced a recalibration. People began to understand that authority doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it removes the need for announcement altogether. This realization unsettled them because it exposed how much of their own behavior was performance, how often they escalated, not because it was necessary, but because it was rewarded. You didn't reward escalation. You didn't punish it either. You simply didn't participate. And systems that rely on participation lose effectiveness when someone opts out without resistance. That's when they stopped saying you were quiet and started saying you were composed. Stopped calling you reserved and started calling you grounded. Those labels were attempts to update a model that never fit to begin with. You weren't grounded because you learned balance. You were grounded because you never outsourced your center. You didn't need the room to affirm you, so the room no longer held influence. That is the moment perception flips. Not when someone proves themselves, but when others realize proof was never required. You didn't earn respect by changing behavior. Respect formed because behavior around you had to change to remain functional. People speak more precisely around someone who doesn't reward filler. They choose actions more carefully around someone who doesn't react impulsively. They preserve effort around someone who doesn't respond to pressure. This isn't admiration, it's adaptation. And adaptation is honest. Admiration can be faked. Adaptation can't. As this understanding spread, quietly and unevenly, a pattern emerged that no one announced but everyone felt. You weren't becoming more powerful. You were becoming more accurately perceived. And accurate perception is disruptive in a culture built on assumptions. The longer they observed you without projection, the clearer it became. You didn't transform. They corrected. And correction always feels like loss to the one who was wrong. That sense of loss is what they mislabeled as your transformation, because admitting you were always this way would mean admitting they spent years reacting to impressions. Impressions about status, impressions about control, impressions about what matters. It's easier to say you changed than to accept that their perception was shallow. But perception always reveals more about the observer than the observed. You were never hiding depth. They just didn't have the range to register it yet. Depth doesn't demand attention, it waits. And waiting exposes impatience in everyone else. As time passed, the contrast became unavoidable. People who relied on urgency began to lose stamina. People who depended on performance began to strain under their own weight. Systems built on reaction started to lose reliability. And in the middle of that, you remained unchanged. That consistency forced comparison, even when no one wanted to make it. They saw how often they had mistaken speed for certainty and noise for conviction. You didn't move faster. You moved clearer, and clarity outlasts intensity every time. When they finally noticed you, it wasn't because you stepped forward. It was because everything else gradually faded. The distractions lost credibility. The performances lost power. The shortcuts stopped working. What remained was you, not elevated, not transformed, simply visible. And visibility at that stage feels like revelation to people who are never really looking. This is why the recognition arrived late and all at once. Perception doesn't improve gradually. It corrects abruptly when the old model no longer held together. That's what happened. Their model shifted. And when it did, they didn't see someone new. They saw how much they had missed. That realization is humbling, which is why they rarely say it out loud. Instead, they nod quietly. They adjust behavior. They choose words more carefully. They stop assuming access. They stop expecting explanation. Because once you are accurately perceived, you no longer need to be explained. You don't have to state yourself. You don't have to remind anyone who you are. The room already knows how to respond. Not because you trained it, because reality corrected them. And reality doesn't negotiate. This is the final understanding they arrive at, often alone and often too late. You didn't become someone new. You simply outlasted their misunderstanding. And when misunderstanding expires, truth doesn't announce itself. It just stands there, unchanged, waiting for everyone else to catch up. And once that catching up happens, there is no return to the old dynamic. People don't suddenly relax around you again. They don't slip back into casual assumptions or unconscious testing. Accuracy changes behavior for the long term. When someone finally sees you clearly, they also see themselves more clearly, in contrast. And that awareness doesn't fade. They recognize how often they rush to label, how quickly they dismissed what didn't announce itself, how much of their judgment was built on noise instead of substance. You become the quiet reference point they measure against without meaning to, not because you demand it, but because clarity creates comparison automatically. From that point forward, interactions simplify. There is less probing, less performance, less negotiation. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. They know which approaches won't work. They know which angles don't apply. They sense there is no advantage in trying to reposition you inside their frameworks. And frameworks lose coherence when they can't contain what they're meant to define. This is why you don't experience the usual cycles of admiration and backlash. Those cycles depend on projection. Once projection fades, the cycle settles. What replaces it is something quieter and more stable: adjustment. People adjust to fundamental realities. They don't argue with them. They don't demand explanations. They account for them and move accordingly. That is the level you reached without effort, without performance, without announcement. You didn't ask to be seen. You didn't wait to be validated. You simply stayed intact long enough for misalignment to wear out. And when misalignment wears out, what remains doesn't feel dramatic. It feels obvious, as if it should have been seen all along. That's why no one celebrates the realization. They internalize it. They carry it forward. They behave differently from that point on. And that is the quiet proof. You didn't become someone new. You didn't arrive late. You didn't transform. You remained, and everyone else finally adjusted to the fact that you always were exactly who you appeared to be. And that is where the story actually settles, even if most people don't realize it has. Because once perception stabilizes at that level, nothing else needs to happen. There is no next phase where you explain yourself. No chapter where you step forward to claim recognition. No moment where you capitalize on being seen. Those are moves for people who still depend on response. You don't. When people finally notice who you were, they don't reward you with applause. They reward you with restraint. They stop projecting futures onto you. They stop assigning expectations. They stop assuming access. Not because you asked them to, but because accuracy makes assumption inefficient. They understand, often without words, that whatever they thought you were missing was never missing at all. It was never your responsibility to be louder, clearer, or more legible. It was their responsibility to develop the capacity to see beyond surface signals. Most didn't. A few eventually did. And those who did changed how they moved through the world afterward. That's the unseen consequence of being accurately perceived. You don't gain attention, you gain space. You gain fewer interruptions, fewer checks, fewer attempts to define you. People don't seek your approval or your reaction. They check themselves before engaging. They choose precision over performance. They choose honesty over advantage seeking. That shift isn't dramatic, but it's long-lasting. Once someone realizes they misread you for years, they don't try again. They adjust and move forward with a different calibration. And you remain exactly where you always were, centered, unavailable to misinterpretation, uninterested in correcting narratives that no longer have influence. You don't carry resentment for being overlooked. Overlooking was never a disadvantage. It filtered out anyone who couldn't operate beyond surface evaluation. Being noticed late didn't change you. It revealed who had the depth to notice it all. And that's why this ending doesn't arrive with triumph or vindication. It arrives with stillness, with a quiet sense that nothing more needs to be said. You didn't become someone new. You didn't evolve into a different version. You simply stayed intact long enough for misunderstanding to expire. And when it did, reality adjusted around you, without ceremony. That's not a transformation story. That's a correction. And corrections don't announce themselves. They settle.